Before the story begins, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, so you don't miss more emotional and surprising stories ahead. And now let's dive into today's story. You actually still live in this place? My daughter-in-law asked the moment she stepped out of her white Lexus and looked at my little cedar house like it was something embarrassing left behind by another century. I simply smiled and adjusted the sleeve of my cardigan, while the wind carried the scent of fresh-cut grass through the yard my late husband had planted with his own hands 32 years ago. The house sat at the end of Maple Crescent, quiet and weathered, its paint slightly faded from years of harsh Ohio winters, its porch swing creaking softly in the afternoon breeze. I had spent the entire morning preparing dinner for my son Brian and his wife Cassandra. Pot roast simmered slowly in the kitchen. Cornbread cooled beside the stove. I even polished the silverware that Frank and I had received as a wedding gift back in 1971. At 71, I no longer entertained often, but I still believed family dinners deserved effort. Cassandra removed her sunglasses and glanced toward the enormous stone mansion next door. The late sunlight reflected against its tall windows and perfectly trimmed hedges. "Now that's a house," she said with a little laugh. "I can't imagine why anyone would stay here when they could live somewhere like that." Brian gave me an uncomfortable smile, as if he wanted me to pretend the comment hadn't happened. He used to defend me when he was younger. I remembered that clearly. But marriage changes some men in quiet ways. "Mom likes simple things," he muttered while carrying in a bottle of expensive wine Cassandra probably picked out for the label rather than the taste. I led them inside without saying much. The dining room felt smaller now than it had years ago when Brian was a boy racing through the hallway with grass stains on his knees. Frank used to sit at the head of the table every Sunday evening, reading the newspaper while pretending not to steal bites of roast before dinner. After cancer took him 4 years ago, the house became quieter than I ever thought possible. But it was still home. Cassandra sat down carefully, almost nervously, like she was afraid the chair might stain her dress. Throughout dinner, she found subtle ways to criticize everything around her without sounding openly cruel. She commented on how quaint the neighborhood felt. She asked if maintaining an older home was financially exhausting. She even laughed softly when she noticed the old thermostat in the hallway. "Honestly," she said while sipping wine, "I don't know how people stay stuck in places like this forever. I'd lose my mind." I focused on cutting my pot roast into small pieces. Outside the dining room window, I could see the mansion glowing softly beneath the sunset. The gardeners had finished an hour earlier, and the marble fountain near the entrance shimmered gold in the fading light. Cassandra followed my gaze and smiled. "Whoever owns that mansion really made something of their life," she said. "That's the kind of success people dream about." For a moment, the room went completely silent except for the ticking clock above the refrigerator. Brian lowered his eyes to his plate, and I simply folded my napkin neatly across my lap because neither of them knew that for the past 26 years, the mansion next door had belonged to me. After dinner, Cassandra wandered through the house with the slow curiosity of someone touring a property she had already judged. I could hear the soft clicking of her heels against the hardwood floors Frank installed himself almost 30 years earlier. Every mark in those floors carried a memory I could still see clearly if I closed my eyes long enough. Near the hallway entrance there was a scratch from Brian crashing his bicycle indoors during a thunderstorm when he was 12. Beside the fireplace was a faint stain from the Christmas Eve Frank dropped an entire tray of hot cider because he was laughing too hard at one of Brian's terrible jokes. Houses remember things even when people pretend not to. I stood quietly at the kitchen sink rinsing plates while Cassandra examined the framed photographs along the wall. "You really kept everything exactly the same," she said. Her voice carried that careful politeness people use when they are trying not to sound judgmental while judging everything. "Most people downsize at your age." I dried my hands slowly with a dish towel. "This house was enough for your father-in-law and me," I replied. "It is enough for me now." She smiled faintly but did not answer. Through the window above the sink, the mansion next door stood glowing beneath the porch lights, elegant and distant like something from another life. Cassandra had not stopped looking at it all evening. Brian stepped onto the back porch with his phone pressed against his ear, probably answering another work call. Ever since he started working with Cassandra's real estate firm in Columbus, he had become obsessed with numbers, property values, investment opportunities. Luxury developments. He used to spend weekends fishing with Frank at Lake Erie wearing old baseball caps and muddy boots. Now he wore tailored jackets that cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Sometimes change happens so gradually you only notice it after the person you loved has already disappeared into someone else. Cassandra leaned against the dining room doorway and crossed her arms. That mansion has been empty for years, right? She asked casually. I never see anyone there. Someone maintains it, I said carefully. Groundskeepers come every week. Do you know the owner? She asked. People in neighborhoods like this usually know each other. I folded the dish towel twice before setting it beside the sink. Some people prefer privacy. Cassandra laughed softly. If I owned a place like that, I would show it off. I looked down at my wedding ring resting against the wrinkles in my hand. Frank always hated showing off too. The year we bought these properties, he told me wealth should make life peaceful, not louder. Most people never understood that about him. Brian returned inside and grabbed his car keys from the counter. We should head back soon, he said. We have a showing early tomorrow morning. Cassandra nodded, but before leaving, she walked once more toward the front window facing the mansion. The moonlight reflected across the stone driveway and tall iron gates. I still cannot believe someone lives next to all of that and stays here instead, she murmured. I opened the front door for them and kissed Brian gently on the cheek the way I always had since he was little. Cassandra hugged me lightly, careful not to wrinkle her coat. Then they drove away beneath the cold October sky while I remained standing on the porch alone. Across the street, the lights inside the mansion slowly turned on one room at a time because Harold Bennett had arrived earlier than expected. The next morning, I woke before sunrise the way I always had during my years with Frank. Old habits stay long after the people connected to them are gone. The kitchen was cold when I walked downstairs in my wool slippers, and for a moment I simply stood there listening to the silence settling through the house. No coffee brewing. No newspaper turning. No footsteps crossing the hallway. Just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of rain beginning outside. I prepared breakfast slowly. 2 eggs. Toast with blackberry jam. Half a cup of coffee with too much cream, exactly the way Frank used to tease me about. Outside the window, the mansion next door looked almost silver beneath the cloudy October sky. The gardeners had arrived again before 8 o'clock sharp. They moved carefully around the fountain and hedges while a black sedan waited near the entrance gates. Harold Bennett believed routines kept people from asking questions. He had managed Frank's legal affairs for nearly 40 years, and after Frank passed away, he quietly continued managing mine. Most people in town assumed Harold worked for the owner of the mansion. Very few realized he worked for me. Around noon, I drove my old Buick into town for groceries. The cashier at Miller's Market still remembered Brian as a little boy who used to steal peppermints from the candy jar near the register. Your son doing well these days? She asked while bagging my apples. Very well, I answered with a small smile. It was easier than explaining how success sometimes changes people in ways money cannot repair. When I returned home, a white SUV sat parked outside my driveway. Cassandra leaned against the hood, scrolling through her phone while wearing oversized sunglasses despite the rain clouds gathering overhead. I was nearby after a property showing, she said casually as I stepped out of the car. Thought I would stop by. She followed me inside carrying the expensive perfume and nervous energy she always seemed to bring into every room. I noticed immediately that her eyes kept drifting toward the mansion through the windows. That place has to be worth at least $8 million, she said while I unpacked groceries. Probably more with the lake access behind the property. I placed a carton of eggs carefully into the refrigerator. Maybe. Cassandra walked toward the front room. Brian said nobody ever talks about the owners. That is strange for a town this small. Some people prefer quiet lives, I replied. She laughed softly. Nobody that rich wants a quiet life. I did not answer. Instead, I wiped rainwater from the kitchen counter and listened to the grandfather clock ticking steadily near the staircase. Cassandra wandered closer to the front window again. You know, she said thoughtfully, if someone owned both properties around here, developers would probably pay a fortune. This entire block could become luxury homes. Her voice had changed slightly. Less mocking now. More calculating. The market in Columbus is exploding. Wealthy buyers want privacy and water views. I looked outside at the wet maple trees bending gently in the wind. Frank planted those trees the summer Brian turned 16. He said he wanted future grandchildren to grow up climbing them someday. Funny how dreams change shape over time. Cassandra turned back toward me with an almost playful smile. Can you imagine inheriting something like that? She asked. Honestly, it would change everything. I met her eyes then. Calmly. Quietly. And for the first time, I realized Cassandra was no longer laughing at my little house. She was trying to figure out how close she was to the fortune sitting beside it. That evening, after Cassandra finally left, I sat alone on the back porch wrapped in Frank's old wool blanket while rain tapped softly against the roof above me. The porch light cast a warm circle across the wooden steps. He built himself the summer Brian graduated high school. Frank always believed a home should feel lived in, not displayed like a showroom. Even now, years after losing him, I could still picture him standing near the yard with sawdust on his jeans and a pencil tucked behind his ear, talking about dreams as if there would always be enough time left to reach them. The mansion next door had started as one of those dreams. Back in 1997, the lakefront property beside our little house went up for sale after a developer went bankrupt. Everyone in town thought Frank had lost his mind when he bought it. We were comfortable then but not flashy. Frank owned several manufacturing supply contracts throughout Ohio, and while the business did well, he never cared much about appearances. Land lasts longer than trends, he used to say. He spent years designing the mansion himself with an architect from Cleveland. Every detail meant something to him. The stone fireplace came from a quarry in Vermont. The library shelves were carved from walnut wood shipped down from Michigan. The gardens were inspired by a small inn we once visited during our anniversary trip to Cape Cod. Frank planned for that mansion to become our retirement home after Brian eventually took over the family business. But life rarely asks permission before changing direction. 6 months before construction finished, Frank received his diagnosis. Pancreatic cancer. Advanced. Aggressive. I still remember the silence in the car after the doctor explained everything. Frank kept staring out the passenger window while snow fell across the hospital parking lot. He did not cry. Neither did I. Some grief arrives too large for tears at first. During his final year, he never once stepped inside the completed mansion. Harold managed the paperwork quietly while I stayed beside Frank through surgeries, treatments, and endless sleepless nights that smelled faintly of medicine and coffee. After he passed away, I could not bring myself to move next door. The mansion no longer felt like a dream. It felt like the future we never reached. So I stayed here instead. In the smaller house. In the rooms where his laughter still lived. Most people assumed the mansion belonged to some wealthy investor from Chicago or New York. Harold kept the ownership hidden through a private trust exactly as Frank requested. People behave differently around money, Frank warned me once. Sometimes even family. Back then I thought he was being overly cautious. Now I understood he had simply been right. Around 9 o'clock my phone buzzed beside me on the porch table. A message from Brian appeared across the screen. Cassandra cannot stop talking about the property next door. Do you know anything about it? I stared at the words for a long moment while rainwater dripped steadily from the porch roof into the dark grass below. Then another message appeared. She thinks whoever owns it might eventually sell. I leaned back slowly in the old porch chair Frank bought at a roadside antique market almost 20 years ago. Across the hedges, the upper lights inside the mansion glowed softly against the stormy sky. Quiet. Elegant. Untouched by the greed already beginning to grow around it. I typed only 4 words before setting my phone down beside the cold untouched tea in my hands. Some things are not for sale. Over the next 2 weeks, Cassandra found more reasons to visit my house than she had in the previous 4 years combined. Sometimes she arrived carrying pastries from expensive bakeries in Columbus. Other times she brought magazines filled with glossy photographs of luxury kitchens and waterfront estates she claimed were just inspiration. I noticed how carefully she studied everything now. The size of my property. The distance between the hedges. The private road leading behind the mansion toward the lake. She no longer looked at my little house with open embarrassment. Instead, she looked at it like a locked door hiding something valuable behind it. One Thursday afternoon, she appeared while I was trimming rose bushes near the mailbox. The air smelled like wet leaves and chimney smoke drifting through the neighborhood. Cassandra stepped out of her SUV wearing a cream-colored coat far too expensive for a quiet suburban street. "I hope I am not interrupting," she said sweetly. I wiped dirt from my gardening gloves and smiled politely. "Not at all." Her eyes moved immediately toward the mansion. "I drove by the county records office this morning," she said casually, pretending the conversation meant nothing. "That property ownership is hidden behind some private trust." I carefully clipped another dead rose from the bush before answering. "Some people value privacy." Cassandra laughed softly. "Or they are hiding something." The wind lifted a few strands of her blonde hair while she studied the tall iron gates across the road. "Honestly, whoever owns that place must be incredibly wealthy. Brian thinks maybe a retired executive or old money family from the East Coast." I said nothing. Silence unsettles people more than arguments ever do. Cassandra shifted uncomfortably before continuing. "You know, with your property sitting right beside it, developers would probably offer millions if the land ever became available together." There it was again. Not curiosity anymore. Calculation. I bent down slowly to gather the trimmed roses into a basket. "Money changes neighborhoods," I said quietly. "Not always for the better." She smiled in that patient way people do when speaking to someone they believe does not understand modern life. "With respect, Eleanor, this town is changing whether people like it or not." Later that evening, Brian called while I was folding laundry upstairs. "Cassandra is obsessed with that mansion," he admitted with an uneasy laugh. "She has been talking about investment possibilities non-stop." I folded one of Frank's old flannel shirts carefully across my lap. Even after 4 years, I still could not bring myself to donate his clothes. "And what do you think?" I asked. There was a pause on the line. "Honestly, the property could be worth a fortune someday." I closed my eyes briefly. Not because of the money, because of how quickly he had begun speaking exactly like her. "Do you remember building treehouses with your father behind that property?" I asked softly. Brian laughed faintly. "I was a kid, Mom." "Yes," I replied. "You were." After we hung up, I walked downstairs and turned off the kitchen lights one by one. Outside, the mansion stood quiet beneath the pale glow of the moon. Harold had warned me years ago that wealth does not reveal character. It reveals hunger. And now, for the first time, I could see that hunger clearly in both of them. Not just in Cassandra's restless ambition, but in Brian's willingness to stand beside it without protest. Across the street, the fountain lights switched on automatically at exactly 9 o'clock, casting silver reflections across the stone driveway, while my little cedar house remained dark and humble beside it. I think that contrast bothered Cassandra more than anything. She could not understand why someone with access to luxury would ever choose simplicity instead. 2 Saturdays later, Cassandra announced she wanted to host a small dinner gathering at my house for what she called family bonding. The phrase alone sounded unnatural coming from her. Still, I agreed politely because refusing would only create questions I was not ready to answer yet. By late afternoon, expensive cars lined both sides of Maple Crescent, while soft jazz music drifted through my living room. Cassandra moved through the house carrying trays of catered food she insisted on ordering from an upscale restaurant in Columbus because, as she delicately explained, small-town cooking is charming, but guests expect more these days. I smiled and thanked her anyway. Some lessons are best learned without interruption. Brian spent most of the evening pouring wine for Cassandra's friends from the real estate office, while pretending he belonged among people who measured success by square footage and luxury brands. I watched him laugh too loudly at conversations that would have once made him uncomfortable. Every now and then his eyes drifted toward me as if searching for approval he no longer knew how to ask for. Outside, autumn leaves scattered across the lawn while warm lights glowed softly from the mansion beyond the hedges. Cassandra noticed several guests admiring it through the windows. "That property is the biggest mystery in town," she said with an amused smile while refilling someone's wine glass. "Imagine owning something that beautiful and never even enjoying it." One of her guests laughed. "Maybe the owner is hiding from taxes." Another joked. "Or hiding from relatives." Everyone chuckled politely. I continued arranging dessert plates near the kitchen counter without reacting. Cassandra stepped closer beside me and lowered her voice just enough to sound confidential. Honestly, Eleanor, if I had access to a place like that, I would never waste my life in a tiny old house. She smiled sweetly after saying it, as though cruelty delivered gently somehow became kindness. Before I could answer, headlights suddenly swept across the front windows. The room quieted instinctively as a long black Rolls-Royce pulled slowly into the driveway beside the porch. Several guests exchanged curious glances. Through the silence, I heard Cassandra whisper, "Oh my God." The driver stepped out first, followed by Harold Bennett wearing a dark wool coat and polished leather gloves. Even from across the room, Harold carried the calm confidence of a man accustomed to handling old money and important secrets. He walked directly toward the front door while conversations around the room faded completely. Brian frowned in confusion as I opened the door before Harold could knock. "Good evening, Eleanor," he said warmly. "I apologize for arriving later than expected." "Not at all, Harold," I replied. Behind me, I could practically feel Cassandra trying to understand who he was. Harold reached into his coat pocket and removed a small velvet box, along with a set of silver keys that immediately caught the chandelier light. "The restoration work at the lake house was completed this afternoon," he said clearly enough for the entire room to hear. "The staff also confirmed your private suite is finally ready." Complete silence filled the house. Cassandra stared at the keys in Harold's hand before looking slowly toward the mansion next door. Then back at me. Her face lost color so quickly it almost frightened me. Brian looked equally stunned. "Wait," he said quietly. "What lake house?" Harold glanced at him politely before returning his attention to me. "The Whitmore estate, of course," he answered. "Your mother's property." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the music from the speakers seemed painfully loud now. And in the middle of that silence, Cassandra finally realized the woman she had spent weeks pitying was the owner of everything she had been desperately trying to reach. For several long seconds, nobody in the room said a word. Cassandra stood frozen near the dining table, still holding a wine glass she no longer seemed aware of. Brian looked from Harold to me, and then toward the mansion outside the windows as though his mind could not arrange the pieces fast enough to make sense of them. The soft jazz music continued playing quietly in the background, but now it sounded distant and awkward against the silence filling the house. Harold removed his gloves calmly and placed the velvet box beside my purse on the entry table. "The contractors also finished restoring the west terrace overlooking the lake," he continued casually. "Your husband's original architectural sketches were followed exactly." Cassandra blinked hard. "Your husband," she repeated faintly. Harold gave her a polite nod. "Frank Whitmore designed the estate personally." Brian stared at me in disbelief. "Mom," he said slowly, "you own the mansion?" I folded my hands gently in front of me. "Your father bought the property many years ago." Cassandra finally found her voice again. "But why would you stay here?" The question came out sharper than she intended, almost desperate now. I glanced around the little cedar house quietly glowing beneath the warm dining room lights. "Because this house was our home," I answered. "The mansion was simply a building." One of Cassandra's guests awkwardly cleared his throat and looked toward the door, as if suddenly realizing he had accidentally stepped into something deeply personal. Harold, however, remained perfectly composed. "The Whitmore estate is currently valued slightly above $12 million, he said matter-of-factly while adjusting his coat sleeve. "Although recent development offers near the lake could increase that considerably within the next few years." I saw Cassandra's entire posture change at those words. The embarrassment disappeared first. Then the judgment. Then the superiority. What remained behind her eyes now was calculation mixed with panic. Brian lowered himself slowly into one of the dining chairs. $12 million, he repeated quietly, almost to himself. I watched him carefully then because that moment hurt more than any insult Cassandra had ever thrown at me. Not because he sounded impressed. Because he sounded different. Softer. More respectful. As though my worth had suddenly increased now that he understood the size of my bank account. Harold glanced toward me. "Would you like me to have the car brought around, Eleanor?" "Not tonight," I replied gently. "Thank you." Cassandra stepped closer almost immediately. "Eleanor, I had no idea," she said quickly. "You never told us any of this." I smiled faintly. "You never asked about me, Cassandra. Only about the property." The room fell silent again. Brian rubbed both hands across his face before looking up at me with visible guilt. Mom, why keep this secret from family? I held his gaze steadily. Because your father once told me money changes the way people look at you. My eyes drifted briefly toward Cassandra. He was right. Nobody argued with that. Outside, rain began falling lightly across the windows while the mansion lights shimmered through the darkness beyond the hedges. The guests started gathering their coats one by one, murmuring uncomfortable goodbyes as they slipped quietly out the front door. Within minutes, only Brian, Cassandra, Harold, and I remained inside the little house Cassandra once mocked so easily. Harold finally nodded respectfully toward me. I will see you tomorrow afternoon regarding the trust documents. Cassandra's eyes widened instantly at the word trust. She tried to hide it, but I noticed. After Harold left, Brian remained seated at the table staring silently at the unfinished glasses of wine while Cassandra stood near the window looking out at the mansion with an expression I had never seen before. She was no longer admiring it. She was trying to understand how completely she had misjudged the woman living beside it all along. Everything changed after that night, although Cassandra tried very hard to pretend. It had not. By Monday morning, she was calling me twice a day instead of once every few weeks. She suddenly wanted recipes I had offered years earlier that she once dismissed as old-fashioned. She started complimenting my garden, my furniture, even the little cedar house she previously treated like an inconvenience standing too close to wealth. There is something so authentic about this place, she said one afternoon while sitting at my kitchen table drinking tea from my best china cups. 2 months earlier she would not have touched those cups because she thought they looked outdated. I stirred honey slowly into my tea and watched her carefully. People reveal themselves most clearly when they think they are finally close to getting what they want. Brian changed too, though more quietly. He began visiting after work without Cassandra sometimes. He fixed the loose porch railing without being asked. He brought groceries inside before I could carry them myself. One evening he even sat beside me on the back porch watching the sunset over the lake the way he used to with Frank years ago. I should have visited more after Dad passed, he admitted softly. I nodded but said nothing. Apologies sound different when guilt arrives after money enters the room. A few days later, Cassandra invited me to lunch at a country club outside Columbus where membership alone costs more than my first car. The hostess greeted her warmly while chandeliers sparkled overhead and women in expensive coats discussed ski vacations near the fireplace. Cassandra smiled proudly walking me through the dining room, as if introducing me to a world she believed I had never belonged to before. You would fit in beautifully here, she said while unfolding her napkin carefully. Honestly, Eleanor, with your background and assets, you should really be enjoying life differently. I looked around the elegant room before answering. Differently from what? Cassandra laughed lightly. From living like someone who has nothing. There it was again. The same belief hidden beneath every compliment she now offered. To Cassandra, simplicity only made sense if it was temporary. She still could not understand. Choosing peace over display. During lunch, she casually asked questions disguised as concern. Have you thought about estate planning lately? The property taxes on a place that size must be enormous. Managing a large estate alone at your age sounds stressful. I answered politely while noticing how carefully she watched every reaction crossing my face. She was no longer trying to discover whether I had money. She was trying to discover where the money would eventually go. Later that week, Harold arrived with several folders regarding trust updates Frank established years earlier. We sat together in the library inside the mansion while afternoon sunlight poured across the walnut shelves Frank once designed himself. Your daughter-in-law contacted my office yesterday, Harold said calmly while reviewing documents. I looked up slowly from my tea. About what? She wanted to discuss potential future development opportunities surrounding the estate. I almost smiled. That was quick. Harold adjusted his glasses. She also asked whether Brian was listed as primary beneficiary. Silence settled gently through the enormous room. Outside the tall windows, lake water shimmered beneath the cold November sky, while distant geese crossed overhead in perfect formation. I leaned back in the leather chair Frank once loved and folded my hands quietly in my lap. Strange how quickly people begin measuring your remaining years once they discover the value of what you own. But what hurt most was not Cassandra's greed. I expected that by now. It was realizing Brian had likely sat beside her during those conversations without once telling her to stop. The first snowfall arrived 3 weeks later, covering Maple Crescent in a soft blanket of white that made the entire neighborhood look quieter than usual. Early that morning, I stood inside the mansion's lakefront library watching snow gather along the stone terrace Frank once dreamed of filling with grandchildren during Christmas holidays. The restoration work was finally complete. Fresh flowers sat near the grand staircase. The fireplaces burned warmly throughout the house. Every room carried traces of the life Frank imagined for us, yet for the first time since losing him, the mansion no longer felt heavy with grief. It simply felt peaceful. Harold entered the library carrying a folder of finalized documents while snowflakes melted slowly across the shoulders of his dark coat. "Everything has been transferred exactly as requested," he said gently. I nodded and signed the final page without hesitation. Outside, I noticed Brian's truck pulling into the circular driveway below. A few seconds later, Cassandra's white SUV followed behind it. Harold glanced toward the window. "Would you like me to stay?" I smiled faintly. "No. I think this conversation belongs to family." By the time Brian and Cassandra entered the library, I was seated beside the fireplace with a cup of tea resting quietly between my hands. Cassandra looked around the enormous room with barely concealed amazement, while Brian seemed strangely nervous beneath the soft chandelier light. "This place is incredible," Cassandra whispered almost reverently. I remembered the first night she laughed at my little cedar house. Strange how respect suddenly appears once marble floors and lake views enter the conversation. Brian sat across from me while Cassandra remained standing near the windows overlooking the frozen shoreline. "Mom," Brian began carefully, "we have been thinking a lot lately about family and the future." I waited silently. Cassandra stepped forward with a practiced smile. "We just feel like family should stay close," she said warmly. "Especially now." There it was again. Not love. Positioning. I placed my teacup gently onto the table beside me. "I agree," I said calmly. Relief crossed both their faces too quickly. Then I continued. "Which is why I finalized my estate decisions this morning." The room became very still. Cassandra sat down slowly beside Brian. "Estate decisions?" she repeated. Harold's folder rested quietly near my chair. I opened it and removed a single document. "The mansion and surrounding lake property will become part of the Whitmore Foundation after my passing," I explained. "It will fund scholarships for widows returning to college and housing assistance for elderly women living alone." Cassandra's expression froze completely. Brian blinked several times. "Wait," he said softly. "The estate is going to a foundation?" I nodded. "Most of it." Silence settled heavily between us while snow drifted quietly outside the tall windows. Cassandra forced a small smile that never fully reached her eyes. "That is very generous," she said carefully. "But surely family is still included." I looked directly at her then. Not angrily. Not bitterly. Simply honestly. "Your father left me enough wisdom to recognize the difference between people who value love and people who value access." Brian lowered his eyes immediately. The disappointment on his face hurt me more than I expected because beneath all the greed and silence, he was still my son. Still the little boy who once built treehouses beside the lake with Frank. I softened my voice slightly. "You will always have enough, Brian. But this estate was never meant to feed ambition. It was meant to create peace." Nobody argued after that. A few minutes later, Brian quietly thanked me for the tea while Cassandra stared one final time across the magnificent room she once believed represented success. Then they left together beneath the falling snow. I remained seated beside the fire long after their cars disappeared down Maple Crescent because for the first time in years, I no longer felt trapped between memory and loneliness. The little cedar house had protected my memories. But this mansion finally belonged to my future. And that's the end of today's story. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.